trying to gain a new insight into the red planet. The latest NASA probe is set to touch down on Mars. Hello and welcome to BBC News. Officials have postponed one of the biggest football matches in Argentina's history after a bus carrying one of the teams was attacked by rival fans, injuring several of the players. The final of the South American Club Championship, the Copa Libertadores, was due to take place between two rival clubs. From Buenos Aires, Lebo de Seco has this report.
Running battles on the streets of Buenos Aires as River Plate fans throw missiles at police. There should have been cheering on their team at the historic football final. Instead, these supporters are part of what looks like a full-blown riot. Earlier, River Plate fans attacked the bus carrying Boca Juniors to the stadium. Boca captain Pablo Perez had an injured eye, apparently after shards of glass got into it. Other players had cuts on their faces, arms and legs. For the fans, there was disappointment and frustration as their evening was cut short.
It's a complete embarrassment. The sad thing is the vast majority of people have come to enjoy this game peacefully with their family and their children, but because of 300 misfits, it's always the same people. Soccer has been hurt.
This was supposed to project a good image of people celebrating. I'm very bitter. I've always hoped that things could change, but they're not changing.
This had been the most anticipated game in the history of the two football giants, the first time they were facing each other in a big South American final. As the Boca team left the stadium, the match had been rescheduled to go ahead on Sunday, but there are still concerns about more violence and ugly scenes to come. Lebo de Seco, BBC News.
The British Prime Minister is in Brussels ahead of Sunday's historic EU summit to formally approve the draft Brexit deal. Theresa May has insisted the UK will always stand by its overseas territory of Gibraltar. She was speaking after Spain dropped its threat to boycott the summit. The EU says it will now go ahead, and the UK's withdrawal deal is expected to be agreed by all leaders. Here's our Europe correspondent, Adam Fleming.
At last, the final steps in the talks to secure Britain's departure from the EU. Theresa May ushered into the European Commission for the second time in a week. Not to negotiate, that's over, but to shake on the final deal. And was that a smile of relief it hadn't been derailed at the last minute?
Prime Minister, did you compromise over Gibraltar?
Hours earlier, her ambassador to the EU had written a letter reiterating how Brexit would affect the ROC, reassuring the Spanish Prime Minister enough that he dropped his threat to boycott tomorrow's summit.
Spain has reached an agreement on Gibraltar. The first thing I want to tell you is that the European Council is therefore going to be held tomorrow.
Arriving for her next courtesy call in Brussels, the Prime Minister said it was a clarification, not a cave-in.
The UK's position on the sovereignty of Gibraltar has not changed and will not change. I'm proud that Gibraltar is British, and I will always stand by Gibraltar.
This process has lasted for 18 months. The Prime Ministers had to shuttle backwards and forwards. It chewed up two Brexit secretaries. It started with a blank sheet of paper and ends with a Brexit deal more than 600 pages long. It's brought us a withdrawal agreement that fixes the divorce terms by guaranteeing the rights of EU nationals in the UK and Brits in Europe, settling the UK's financial obligations, estimated at £39 billion, with an insurance policy to avoid checks on the Irish border. There's also a roadmap to the future relationship, one based on free trade, not necessarily the frictionless trade promised by the Prime Minister, with continued cooperation on security and unlimited migration from the EU. Free movement will come to an end. While Theresa May has breakfast here tomorrow, her fellow leaders will rubber stamp their side of the bargain. Then she'll be shown into the room. History made before Sunday lunch. Adam Fleming, BBC News, Brussels.
Well, as we've been hearing, Theresa May has written an open letter to the nation urging people to back her Brexit deal. Our political correspondent Alex Forsyth says the letter is an attempt to change the widespread opposition she faces in Parliament.
Well, Theresa May knows she's got some pretty fierce critics in Parliament who don't like this Brexit deal. And so what she's doing is pitching it directly to the public. This is a letter to the nation when she talks about her sense of duty in trying to negotiate a deal which honours the referendum result. She says it's the right deal for those who'd backed Leave and those who'd backed Remain. And she deliberately uses, I think, some quite strong and fairly emotive language in this letter. She talks about the date when we will finally leave the European Union on March the 29th next year as being a moment of renewal and reconciliation for the country to come together. And she says she's going to campaign with her heart and soul to try and get Parliament to back this deal. The problem is there are already a number of MPs, including a number in her own party, who have said quite frankly that they will not be supporting it. So Theresa May might be trying to persuade the public in the hope that that might shift a few minds in Parliament. But whether that will be enough to get this deal through, well, that's another question.
Alex Forsyth. Well, there's more on Brexit with analysis, research from our correspondents and editors, all on our website, bbc.com/news. Let's get some of the day's other news now. The President of Zimbabwe says his predecessor, Robert Mugabe, is in Singapore receiving medical treatment and is now unable to walk. It's exactly a year since Mr. Mugabe was forced to resign. During his last few years in office, he made several trips out of the country for unexplained health reasons. Voters in Taiwan have rejected same-sex marriage despite a ruling by the island's top court that a ban was unconstitutional. In polls to elect local leaders held at the same time, the Democratic Progressive Party suffered a number of heavy defeats, prompting President Tsai Ing-wen to resign as chair of the party. Deforestation in Brazil's Amazon region has reached its highest level in a decade, increasing by nearly 14% since last year. Nearly 8,000 square kilometres of the world's largest rainforest was destroyed between August 2017 and July 2018. The French president has criticised demonstrators who clashed with police in Paris during protests sparked by rising fuel prices. Emmanuel Macron tweeted, "Shame on those who attacked officers." Police used tear gas and water cannon to disperse protesters on the Champs-Élysées. Lucy Williamson reports from Paris.
This a reminder for France's president. Sparks can quickly ignite into flames. The Champs-Élysées, not a tourist site today, but an unofficial battleground. Protesters armed with paving stones, pushed back by tear gas, water cannon, riot police. This movement is about more than fuel prices. Its supporters tired of taxes, tired of politicians. Their slogans threatening revolution. The French authorities, a joke to some.
We have to pay for rent, food, insurances and telephone. What's left at the end of the month? Nothing. I don't want Macron to just cut taxes, I want him to resign.
Why is it always the little taxpayer who has to pay? We've been tightening our belts for 30 years. If it gets any tighter, we're going to explode.
The government banned protesters from this street today, pointing them to the Eiffel Tower instead. The far-right leader Marine Le Pen questioned why. The government says she's encouraging dissent.
The ultra-right is mobilized and has answered Marine Le Pen's call. They want to attack institutions. They want to attack governing MPs.
The government said no protests on this street, and look what happens. They say ultra-right elements are responsible for the violence here, but many ordinary people say they also support this movement. This protest has brought together people from all political backgrounds, all parts of France. But it's a movement with no national leader, no formal structure. Its membership and its identity hard to control. Tonight, with protests dying down, the government has said it's listening, but there's no sign yet it's changing course. Security forces can clear the barricades, but political resistance is far harder to quell. Lucy Williamson, BBC News, Paris.
Leaders of the incoming Mexican government say they're still discussing how to deal with migrants travelling to the United States, following reports that a deal had been reached with the Trump administration. The Washington Post said Mexican officials had agreed to let migrants trying to enter the US stay in Mexico while their asylum claims were heard. But the incoming Mexican foreign minister denied that any decision had been reached on the issue. A convoy of almost 3,000 Central American migrants has reached the Mexican border city of Tijuana, hoping to gain entry into the US. Well, earlier I spoke to Emily Green. She's a freelance journalist based in Mexico City, and I asked her if anything had actually been agreed with the Mexican government.
It's hard to say. As you noted, the Washington Post reported earlier today that it seemed pretty close to a done deal. Since then, the incoming administration of President López Obrador has denied that and said there's no done deal, that there's no deal between the incoming administration and President Trump. So it's hard to say what's actually going to happen, but it does seem to be clear that negotiations have taken place and are taking place.
We're hearing that Tijuana has declared some sort of humanitarian crisis. That's being reported in some papers. How difficult a situation is it? How much help does Mexico need?
Right, about 5,000 migrants have arrived in Tijuana in the past 2 weeks alone. So it's a lot of people. Of course, Tijuana is historically a town that has received many migrants. It's right on the border with the U.S. This is nothing new to receive many migrants. 5,000 in 2 weeks' time is a lot. On Friday, the mayor of Tijuana declared an emergency, said he's going to ask for help from the United Nations. But I also think that his political bent is not one of embracing migrants and migration, so there's a little bit of politics and reality at play.
What is going to be the reality for those migrants and asylum seekers if they do have to wait in Tijuana and other border places while their case is heard?
So a little bit of background. I mean, to get an asylum case finalized in the United States right now takes months and frequently years. It can take as long as 5 to 7 years. So now we're talking about, if this deal actually happens and goes into effect, that asylum seekers would be waiting in Mexico for years on end until their case is adjudicated, determined in the United States. For those that have a legitimate fear and are fleeing violence, that could be quite terrifying, to know that you are not in a place of safety. In general, right now what we're seeing in Tijuana are basically camps, shelters of thousands of migrants. And as is, before this agreement was even talked about, they were planning for the long haul, to stay there for months on end. So now we're talking about perhaps not months on end, but years on end of them camped out in Tijuana with an uncertain future.
Emily Green there, talking to us earlier, journalist in Mexico City. But do stay with us on BBC News, still to come.
I send your food back to get it warm. The mastic that works is...
The master of suspense and style, Nicholas Roeg, who directed films such as Don't Look Now, has died at the age of 90.
President Kennedy was shot down and died almost immediately. The murder of John Kennedy is a disaster for the whole free world. He caught the imagination of the world, the first of a new generation of leaders.
Margaret Thatcher is resigning as leader of the Conservative Party Prime Minister. Before leaving number 10 to see the Queen, she told her cabinet, "It's a funny old world."
Angela Merkel is Germany's first woman chancellor, easily securing the majority she needed.
Attempts to fly a hot air balloon had to be abandoned after a few minutes, but nobody seemed to mind very much. As one local comic put it, it's not hot air we need, it's hard cash.
Cuba has declared 9 days of mourning following the death of Fidel Castro at the age of 90. Castro developed close ties with the Soviet Union in the 1960s. It was an alliance that brought the world to the brink of nuclear war with the Cuban Missile Crisis.
This is BBC News, the latest headlines. One of the biggest matches in South American football, the Copa Libertadores final, is postponed after a bus carrying the Boca Juniors team is attacked in Buenos Aires. And after Theresa May's day of meetings in Brussels, the EU says it's ready to sign the Brexit withdrawal agreement on Sunday's special summit. Let's get more now on that violence in Argentina. Tim Vickery is our South American football correspondent. He spoke to us a bit earlier and he said it came as no surprise.
It's a disaster, really, for South American club football. In the glorious history of South American club football, this match is, I think, the biggest thing that's ever happened. It's got the biggest global audience that has ever watched a club game between two South American sides. And I'm afraid you've come into our house and you've seen everything in a huge mess. There are real problems in South American societies and in South American football, and some of them came to the surface. And what we saw with the attack on the team bus of Boca Juniors is perhaps in part football hooliganism. It's also in part corruption and corrupt values of a society moving in the wrong direction. The organised groups of thugs in Argentina, it's not just hooliganism, it's business. They make their living from being thugs. They get a cut from players' wages, a cut of transfer deals even is sometimes alleged, and they make money from ticket sales on the black market. And one interpretation of the violence that we saw is that the organised groups of thugs were responsible because one of their touting operations, and they could make a fortune on the black market selling tickets for this game, one of their touting operations was interrupted, and this was their revenge, this was their response. So totally inadequate precautions there in security, and it's obvious that the route of the Boca Juniors coach on the way to the stadium should have been cordoned off at key moments. It was clear well over an hour before the scheduled kickoff that this game really shouldn't have gone ahead. Players had been injured, players' safety should surely be paramount, and the players there of Boca Juniors were not in physical or psychological conditions to play this game. And yet it took hours and hours and hours for a final decision to be reached, and it was the clubs who pushed for this decision to be for the game to be put back 24 hours. To the shame of the authorities in this part of the world, they were trying to get the game played. The kickoff time kept on being put back and back and back, and in the end, over 2.5 hours after the scheduled kickoff time, more than 3.5 hours after it was clear that the game shouldn't take place, it was announced that the game will take place instead on Sunday. Now, I have to tell you that there's already a doubt with that. The local council in Buenos Aires has banned River Plate Stadium because it exceeded its capacity for Saturday's match and emergency exits were blocked. Now, that should be negotiable. River Plate should be able to pay a fine and ensure that the game goes ahead on Sunday. But at the moment, that's not 100% confirmed. So I'm afraid the chaos just gets deeper and deeper.
Our South American correspondent there, Tim Vickery. Now, archaeologists have found an ancient Egyptian tomb which is believed to be more than 3,000 years old. The discovery on the west bank of the Nile at Luxor contained 2 mummies encased in coffins, which researchers said had been perfectly preserved. Sadalba Hadari reports.
This ancient coffin is one of the 2 discovered in Luxor, on the banks of the River Nile. It contains the mummy of a woman, almost perfectly preserved in linen inside a coffin for more than 3,000 years. Ancient Egyptians mummified humans to preserve their bodies for the afterlife. The woman was named Thuya and was from the 18th Egyptian dynasty, whose most famous pharaohs include Tutankhamun and Ramses II. It's the first time Egyptian authorities have opened a sealed sarcophagus before the international media. The discovery was made by a French-led mission in the northern region of El Asasif, alongside other significant finds.
September 2018, we did continue the work, and then we found the side chamber. It was sealed with mud bricks, so we did open it. We found almost 2 intact wooden coffins in perfect condition of preservation with flowers in the top of them.
The other tomb from 4,000 years ago belongs to Thau Rechet If, the overseer of the mummification shrine, along with 1,000 miniature figurines of servants, which ancient Egyptians believed would serve the dead in the afterlife. The archaeologists removed 300 meters of rubble over 5 months to uncover the tomb, which contains colored wall scenes depicting the owner and his family. So far, Egypt has revealed over a dozen ancient discoveries this year. Sadaba Haidari, BBC News.
And one of Britain's most original film directors, Nicholas Roeg, has died at the age of 90. He had a career spanning 6 decades and was celebrated for his original and controversial filmmaking. John Donaldson looks back at his career.
I sent your food back to get it warm.
Julie Christie and Donald Sutherland in Nick Roeg's masterpiece, Don't Look Now.
Stand up.
It was sumptuous and eerie, both hypnotising and unsettling. He was a cameraman before he was a director. Here he is on the set of Fahrenheit 451, filming Julie Christie. He was director of photography on Dr. Zhivago, but fell out with the director, David Lean, who sacked him. His replacement won an Oscar, partly for Roeg's work.
Why don't you go to a hotel?
His first film as director was Performance, with Mick Jagger as a rock star and James Fox as a gangster.
I remember you in Hemlock Road, 1956.
It included graphic scenes of violent sex and drug taking.
You know, Tommy, you're really a freak.
The first man in your life?
I don't mean that unkindly.
The Man Who Fell to Earth featured another musician, David Bowie, in a sprawling work of science fiction. He could be driven. On one film, the crew threatened a walkout when he filmed for 24 hours non-stop.
No, La Barca.
But no other British director could match Nick Roeg's visual imagination or his skill at wrong footing, bewildering and delighting audiences.
Nicholas Roeg, who's died at the age of 90. Now, NASA's latest mission to Mars is due to land on the Red Planet on Monday. It's not an easy mission, and success depends on precise calculation. All about NASA's latest mission to Mars, and that lander is due to touch down at 8 p.m. GMT. So we will bring you all of the latest here on BBC News. Do stay with us.
Hello, thanks for joining me. In the short term, no big changes to our weather. That will come, but it won't arrive until the middle part of the week. As far as Sunday's concerned, actually for most of us it's looking decent enough and pretty good as well across the south of the country, where recently we've had a lot of cloud and some rain too. Now here's the big picture across the continent. A lot of blue, so that means that the air's still cold and it's coming out of eastern parts of Europe and also Scandinavia. But that will change, as I say, by the time we get to around about Tuesday, Wednesday. Milder air starts to arrive off the Atlantic. Here's the early hours of Sunday morning. Temperatures will be above freezing in bigger towns and cities, 2 degrees, say, in Edinburgh, around about 6 or 7 in the south, but we will have pockets of frost here and there, especially where we would have seen clearer skies overnight, and that's probably across western Scotland and Northern Ireland. Now Sunday itself at times will be cloudy, so not promising clear blue skies, and in fact you might even need your umbrella from time to time in the northwest of the country. There could be a few showers here carried by that easterly wind, but in the south a better day. Temperatures will get up to around 8 degrees in London, so still pretty chilly, and only 6 Celsius expected in Edinburgh. Now here's the big picture on Monday. Now you'll notice a big low pressure sitting out there in the Atlantic. It is heading our way, but it won't reach us until Monday night at western parts of the UK. So Monday, still a quiet day. In fact, very little wind first thing in the morning on Monday. There'll be some mist and fog around, quite tricky driving conditions maybe out in the countryside first thing on Monday, particularly around, say, western and central areas of the UK. But the day itself is going to be fairly decent and still chilly. Temperatures will be no higher than around 6 again in Edinburgh, 7 maybe in Liverpool, possibly getting up to around 10 degrees in Plymouth. And then Monday night into Tuesday we start to see a change. That big low in the Atlantic starts whooshing in much milder air, much milder air in our direction, but with that you can see a lot of arrows here, so that means stronger winds, in fact risk of gales on the way, and it is a big area of low pressure with smaller lows even running around it, and these could be responsible for bringing some very strong winds to some parts of the country during the course of the week. So we're keeping an eye on next week. There'll be a fair bit of rain on our way, but look at that. Look at those temperatures, 14 degrees Celsius. But remember, gale force winds potentially almost anywhere in the UK. That's it for me. Bye-bye.
Stories set to shape the news agenda. Headlines, freshly written. Original perspectives on the day's unfolding narratives. See the bigger picture as it emerges. The papers, tonight at 10:30 and 11:30 on the BBC News Channel.
This is weird, isn't it?
No, still weird. But if there's a report about where I live or what I do...
It usually sounds like this.
Or it might be this.
Or maybe even this.
Or sometimes this.
The BBC Young Reporter competition wants to change that.
If you're aged between 11 and 18 and have a story you think needs telling, the BBC can help you tell it. Find your voice and enter now at bbc.co.uk/Young Reporter competition.
This is BBC News, the headlines. One of the biggest football matches in Argentina's history, the Copa Libertadores final, has been postponed after the Boca Juniors team bus was attacked by rival fans in Buenos Aires. They were due to play River Plate. Theresa May has written an open letter to the British public urging people to back her Brexit deal. The plan was finalised with the European Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker in Brussels ahead of a historic summit on Sunday, but it faces widespread opposition in the British Parliament. Police in Paris have used tear gas and water cannon to disperse tens of thousands of protesters, calling for an end to fuel tax rises. Protests by a grassroots movement, identified by their high-vis jackets, have been held across France for the second weekend running. Those are the headlines. Now, the search is on for missing footage of Sir David Attenborough, first aired on the BBC almost 50 years ago. Staff at the Royal Institution are asking the public to look in their attics for any recordings of their Christmas science lectures by Sir David, after realising 31 broadcasts are missing from their collection. Our media and arts correspondent David Sillito reports.
We will have a little protein dance. Okay?
Carl Sagan in 1977 doing the protein dance.
Very good. Can you get a different note on it?
Christopher Zeman and the science of music.
Heart rate 126. You must be calming down, Robert. How do you feel now compared to before? Great.
These lectures have been a Christmas tradition The Royal Institution was putting all of these televised lectures online. Is asking the public if they have copies of the missing programmes hidden in a locket and stored in a garage. They're television's first ever science marathon, and hoping that some of their technologically inclined viewers will be able to help them complete the full collection. David Sillito, BBC News.
Now BBC News, Our World asks who cares about Israel's tight workers.
Every year, thousands of people come from Thailand to work in Israel, hoping to build a better life for the families back home. But what they find when they get here can be shocking. For more than a year, we have been investigating the treatment of Thai laborers working on Israel's farms. Their labor helps to produce fruit and vegetables sold across the globe, but they are anxious their work is damaging their health.
ท้องมันแบบปั่นป่วนแล้วมันก็มีน้ำออกมาอยู่นิ้วเราแล้วมันก็ทรมานเพราะว่าสเปรย์ยาเนี่ยมันทรมาน
And many deaths amongst the workers remain uninvestigated. In this field, we'll be asking, who cares about Israel's Thai workers? A country rich in history and one of the world's wealthiest nations. Despite being half desert, Israel grows millions of tons of fruits and vegetables every year and exports them to Europe and Russia. A modern miracle of hydro-engineering. And an industry reliant on migrant workers. But everything is not as it seems. I'm Saria Platoniyam, and I'm a journalist with East Thai Service in London. Just over a year ago, I started to get worrying messages from Thai workers in Israel. They were telling me that they were being abused and exploited. Being from Thailand myself, I wanted to find out what was happening. We've started our investigation in farm not far from Gaza. Agriculture in Israel is organized into hundreds of gated communities called moshavs, and each moshav contains dozens of farms and farmhouses.
So this is moshav Tikuma. It's actually looks like that here. Big trees, beautiful flowers, nice houses.
This is the home of a well-established farming family on the moshav. The Thai workers they employ live just a stone's throw away. 15 workers share deeds with the workers. This accommodation isn't temporary. The work here isn't seasonal. These are the only homes these young men and women will move in Israel. Somkit was 29 when he met him. Like most of the workers here, he's from the northeast of Thailand. He had left his village 3 years before because his parents and his wife were often going without food. He's afraid to show me around.
ครับมาดูห้องนอนว่าความต้องการอะไรเขาแปลงปรุงให้ใหม่ครับนี่ครับผนังมันปลูกครับเอาลูกหลังคอตามน้ำบางทีก็ปลูกนะครับปลูกมีหนูน้องยางคือครับงานในสวนอากาศร้อนๆในช่วงหน้าหนาวก็ฝนทำงานที่ห้องต้องมีห้องยังรั่วอีกต้องมาดูห้องอีกครับ
Many of these laboring jobs used to be done by Palestinians, but not anymore. Somkit is in Israel as part of an official government scheme. He's one of 25,000 Thai nationals working and living here.
This type of accommodation is sadly not unusual. Workers here tell me that temperatures inside can reach more than 40 degrees, and they are scared that at any point the whole thing would collapse.
We asked Somkit's boss for an interview. He refused, but he told us later that since our visit, he's made some improvements to the workers' home. Investigating the lives of the Thai workers on Israel's farms isn't easy. There's a climate of fear. Few people will talk to us in Arabic. But over 14 months, we visited more than 50 farms and spoke to hundreds of workers to get to the truth. We are heading to a small moshav called Paran in the deep south of the country. There are several cow sheds on Paran. The animals seem well housed. The workers less so. We have told this worker is frightened, so we have agreed to hide his real identity. He lived here behind the cow shed for a year.
ก็จำเป็นเพราะว่าเราไม่เกี่ยวอะไรอยู่เราฝันเยอะเกินเงินเดือน7,000แต่ก็จะอยู่ได้บ้านเดือนละ2-3,000เนี่ยแต่คนไทยก็2-3 หมื่น
Like many of the other workers told us, if he was caught speaking out, he would be sacked and left jobless and homeless in a foreign land. The fear is palpable, but it wasn't long until I understood why.
We arrived at Moshav Paran. We asked the shopkeeper inside to contact local farmers on the phone, he told us that we are making a documentary for the BBC. He told us to leave our boat out and get people from otherwise to call all the foreigners to come and break up. Agriculture in Israel is a multi-billion-pound industry. It's hard work, but for those farmers who make a success of it, the benefits are easy to see. This is Lachish, the most beautiful moshav we saw, and is built on revenue from grants. We have come to take a closer look at one of the farms. Ashimari has lived in Lachish for 20 years. He says he employs 3 workers and he is keen to show me where they live. Then something strange happens. Mr. Mahdi wouldn't let us take our cameras into his warehouse. What he didn't know at this point was 5 months ago. We'd already filmed inside. And this is what we found. A man sleeping in what appeared to be a makeshift bedroom complete with a kitchen. And it's all just meters away from the King George. Although Mr. Mahdi won't let us feel inside the warehouse today, we did manage to take a look at the man we'd seen sleeping there 5 months earlier. He was still there. We asked Mr. Mahdi about him.
היה תאילנדי שלו, לא שלי. הם לפעמים לא מוצאים בעניין ממושב אחר, באים לפה. יומיים, 3, נותנים את החבר שלהם. ישנים פה, לא שזיקים לשמור. העובדים שלי יש לנו כולם בתוך החברה. אני אמרתי להם, לא נשים בו, בעניין, הם באים לפה, אז לא באים לו אחד, באים יומיים, 3, אני בכלל לא יודע.
Child workers are allowed to stay in Israel for a maximum of 5 years. During their stay, they are entitled to expect a reasonable level of comfort and safety. According to the workers' handbook, they should be provided with suitable housing, including at least 4 square meters of sleeping space, personal cupboards, bedding, heating, ventilation. Everything is laid out in black and white. In the dozens of farms we saw, there weren't many